So last one from me, just before I hand over to the experts, just a bit of background on why we are running this session at NCVO. So I'm from the practical support team along with Josie, and we answer 400 to 500 queries every month from small voluntary organisations and charities. And setting up is one of our top areas for inquiries. And we know that the process can be very confusing and frustrating. As you may know, the Small Charities Coalition, who did a lot of work in the arena of setting up, and I used to work there, closed in March, and NCVO, along with our partner, the FSI, took over the SCC help desk and charity setup tool. And we're really keen to carry on SCC's legacy of supporting small organisations in their early stages. We want to dispel any myths, clarify any jargon, and make the complex simple. And as I mentioned already, we have also taken over the charity setup tool, which was set up by SCC. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Chris, Philip, and Hannah from Withers to carry on the presentation.
Great. Can I just check, Amy, you can hear me okay?
Great.
Perfect. Brilliant. Well, very nice to see so many of you joining. For those in the warmer parts of the country at the moment, I hope you've got lots of cool water with you to keep you going through this presentation. My name is Chris Priestley. I head up the charities team at Withers. All I do is work with charities, advising charities or people wanting to set up charities or work with them. And we're delighted today to be partnering with our client NCVO on this presentation. Just moving on to the next slide. I'll be joined by my colleagues Phil Reid and Hannah Brearley, so they'll introduce themselves when we get to their sessions. And just to cover what we thought we'd do today, we'll try and run for about 45 minutes max in terms of the presentation, but do use the chat function to ask questions as we go along. And we hope to keep this as interactive as possible. So we'll try and finish up with a good 45 minutes to answer questions. And I think Amy and Josie, we're planning, if we don't get to all the questions, or even some of the questions that we have answered, we'll circulate the answers to those so everybody has that information to hand. Because as I say, we want this to be as useful to you as possible. What we're going to cover is first of all, just looking at, setting up a charity. I think that the first question is in fact a charity the right option for you? What else might you think about? If you have decided to set up a charity, we'll talk a bit about the different legal structures that are available, the registration process itself with the Charity Commission, and then we'll signpost some useful resources. And as I said, we'll have a session at the end on questions and answers. So just moving on to the next slide. So I think the starting point, and I always talk to clients about this when they come to me to say, we're thinking about setting up a charity, just to stress test that actually is the right thing. That's what you absolutely want to do. And if you think of the spectrum of organisations that are available, at one end you've got the sort of traditional for-profit trading company, which is there to drive profit for its shareholders and owners. And at the other end, you've got a not-for-profit charitable organisation, which exists to further charitable purposes for the public benefit. It's certainly possible, of course, to set up your own charity, and lots of people do that for community-led projects because it's a condition of funding. Funders want to fund into an existing charity, or because perhaps for fundraising purposes, you want to set up an organisation in memory of a loved one, for example. I always say, instead of thinking about setting up your own charity, that is a process that clearly is available. But one option would be to say, well, actually, should we work with an existing charity? Is there somebody else out there that we might want to work with? That would be quicker, probably more cost effective, certainly in the short term, rather than setting up your own charity. So that is something just to consider. There are things called donor advised funds. Those are existing charities like NPT or Charities Aid Foundation. They're already registered charities, and they can hold charitable funds and distribute them in accordance with the donor's wishes. So for some organisations, that is an option to avoid having to set up their own charity. But there are very limited circumstances, I expect, for this audience where that might be the right solution. I said at the beginning, in the spectrum of organisations, you have a for-profit organisation at one end and a not-for-profit at the other. I suppose a community interest company is in the middle. It's a social enterprise. It's there to support purposes that are beneficial to the community, but it's a sort of hybrid. So it is possible for it to pay dividends or to repay loans to those who are investing in the company, but there is an asset lock. So that means there is a limited amount of money that can go out into private hands, and the rest needs to be reinvested in the business. So that's the sort of halfway house. And there are lots and lots of community interest companies. I remember helping with the consultation to set them up, and I think they're now around 17,000 in existence. They can be companies limited by shares or limited by guarantee, but a community interest company isn't a charity. And so it doesn't get, which we'll come on to, the tax breaks like gift aid that are available to charities, but it is a form of social enterprise. So that's another option. The penultimate option there is to say, well, actually, we do want a not-for-profit company. We do want to set up a not-for-profit organisation, but we don't want it to be a charity because we don't want the constraints that come with charity regulation, for example. Again, though, you wouldn't be able to benefit from the tax breaks. You wouldn't be a charity, you'd be a non-charitable, not-for-profit company. And sometimes that might be the right solution. And then, of course, finally, there is the option of just setting up a standard trading company. It isn't a charity, but I suppose any profits or some of the profits that are made in that business could be donated to charity. So you could route things through that option, but you would, to the extent you made profits, you'd have to give them to an existing charity. There are more complex structures, and so many charities themselves have their own underlying trading companies for various reasons. But that's a sort of overview on making sure that charity is the right option for you. So just moving on to the next slide then. I think, Phil, you're going to take this one.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, I'm a colleague of his, another partner in the Charities and Philanthropy team with us. So I'm going to run through a bit more about making sure charity is the right option. And Hannah's going to give us a live demo in a moment about finding objects. So begin at the beginning when we're setting up a charity or we're thinking about it. I always suggest to clients or would-be charity founders that they really start with their mission. You think, I've considered all of those options that Chris has gone through. I do think I want to do a charity. What is actually the mission? What is the good thing that I want to set up, that I want to achieve? And then once you've identified that, then it's thinking about what will my activities actually be? What will the work be that I want to do that furthers that mission? And those two questions go a long way towards helping you to set up your charity in the right way. You also need to think about who's going to do this stuff. One individual can't really set up and operate a charity effectively. So it's making sure that you're going to be able to get the right people in post who have the right skills, knowledge and experience to be effective charity trustees, and that there are also the resources available that will allow you to carry out your activities that further your mission. Starting point in legal terms within all of that is condensing your mission and activities into what we call charitable objects, which you'll also see called charitable purposes. And that's really a usually quite short, paragraph or two statement in your governing document. And we'll go into different types of governing document for different structures a bit later. But a statement in quite specific legal language that says really what kind of charity you are and what you're there for. Writing charitable objects is a slightly tricky thing. I would say that, I suppose, but we quite enjoy doing it. It can be quite knotty. It can be relatively simple. It slightly depends on what you're up to. And often you'll see that set of objects, those couple of paragraphs containing both your mission and your activities. And increasingly, the Charity Commission likes to see both of those things in charitable objects. So let's say you're a school, your charitable purpose would be the advancement of education. Your activity would be by operating a school. So overall, your object would say the advancement of education by operating a school. But let's have a look at some other charitable purposes. Next slide, please, Hannah. So on the slide here, these aren't all of the possible charitable purposes that are out there, but these are certainly the main ones that are listed out in the Charities Act 2011. So some obvious ones that you'd expect to see: poverty, education, religion. There are also some slightly more unusual ones, like the bottom right on that list, the efficiency of the armed forces and emergency services. Saving lives is in there, the arts, community development. So there is an exercise in working out where you think you fit in this, and then getting on to how you express that. And it's really helpful to look at what some other people have done before. So Hannah's just going to show you now how you can do that.
Thanks, Bill. Morning, everybody. So my name is Hannah. I am an associate in the charities team at Withers. So as Bill has said, sometimes it can be really helpful for you to see what some other charities, maybe with a similar goal and similar purposes, have done for their charitable purposes, to give you some hints with your own drafting. So what we're going to look at is the charity register. So I hope that is now showing on the screen.
Yep.
So this is gov.uk, find charity information. This is all the publicly available information about charities in England and Wales. And you click on Start Now, and what you can see then is the publicly available information about charities. What's really helpful when you're drafting your charitable objects is this bit, the advanced search, which enables you to look at different parts of the information available about charities, including their objects and activities. As you can see here, this tick box. So what I'm going to do, just to show you, is to untick all these various boxes. So we're just looking at objects and activities, but as you can see, you can search by a range of different criteria depending on what information you're looking for. And then what we're going to do is we're going to search for environment, fairly broad search term. And as you can see, we have 8,380 matches here. And what we're now going to do is just have a look. And as you can see, these are all the results that turned up from that fairly broad search term. What we're now going to look at, for example, See Trust Wales. And you have all this information. And for those of you looking at setting up a charity, this is the information that is publicly available once you register with the Commission. In order to look at the charity's objects, we scroll down and look at Governing Document. Now, you won't be able to see the full text of the governing document on this web page, but what you can see are the charitable objects. So let's just click on More so we see the full paragraph. As Phil explained, it's a paragraph here that sets out, in this case, the objects of the charity, so what it's trying to achieve. So to advance the education for the public benefit in the subjects of marine and freshwater wildlife, as well as promote for the benefit of the public the conservation, protection, and improvement of that environment. And then at the end, it has a geographical limit as well. So that, for example, if you were looking at doing something similar, you can use this sort of search function to find other charities that have similar objects and use them as a basis. And of course, you have the reassurance here of knowing that all of these charities have been registered by the Commission. So these objects were clearly accepted. Just to note, what you can also see And the reason I picked this one is a very recent one. So this is a CIO that was registered in 2019, 2022. Do have a check when things were registered if you're looking at objects, simply because the Charity Commission's approach throughout the years does sometimes change. And so looking at something with very old objects, it might be slightly, the wording might not be accepted anymore, or it might just not be the best basis to use for your own drafting. So I'll just pop back to the slides.
Thanks, Hannah. So I'm just going to talk a little bit before Chris gets into different legal structures about another legal issue which charity founders need to be aware of, which is public benefit. So every charity has to operate for exclusively charitable purposes and for the public benefit. It has two senses. The first one seems pretty obvious. So what you're doing actually has to be beneficial. Take the example of a new medical treatment that your charity is looking to deliver. There has to be some genuine evidence that says that that medical treatment actually works before you can be registered as a charity. The second sense of public benefit is that the benefit has to flow to a sufficient section of the public. So there has to be a decent chunk of people who can potentially benefit from what you're doing. And this is where charging becomes an issue for charities. So let's say, as Keir Starmer might like us to think about this week, take the example of a charitable independent school charging fees. Charging fees obviously reduces the number of people who can access the benefits of the charity. So that's where you'd be looking through a public benefit lens at particular types of charity. And there can be other issues of access to think about as well, physical access and preserving a particular site, whatever it might be. You'd also think here about whether people are being paid. And that could take a variety of forms. It can be possible for trustees to be paid in the right circumstances. But if there's too much private benefit, as we would say, flowing to individuals as a result of a charity's activities, then in fact, the Commission would say that's not a charity. So the question, when you're at the outset really, is everything that we want to do both charitable within those purposes that we looked at and for the public benefit? And as Chris said, if the answer is yes, then maybe a charity. If the answer is no, it might be that you do something else, or it might be that you have a charity doing some things and non-charity doing other things. There are various different ways to do it. And now I will hand back to Chris.
Thanks, Phil. And I saw there was a question in the chat on this topic, so hopefully I'll answer it. When we, as I said at the outset, when you're thinking about setting up a charity, there are a number of different legal structures you can choose from, and it's important to make an informed choice to make sure you've got the right thing, because it's much more difficult to change that structure once you've registered. And I suppose the two different categories of structure can be defined by sort of unincorporated charities and incorporated charities. So the difference between the two is, bizarrely, that as a matter of law, an unincorporated organisation doesn't exist as a legal person. It only exists through the people that are involved in officer or control and management roles. Unincorporated associations are still around. They are usually used now for very, very small organisations, but they don't have separate legal existence. They have a constitution, and they will have probably something called a management committee or an executive committee, who are the people that take legal responsibility for the organisation, and who would be the charity trustees. But if the unincorporated association wanted to enter into funding agreements or any contracts, it's got to enter into those in the names of the individuals who are members of that committee, and that gets pretty cumbersome. Unincorporated organisations also don't have the benefit of limited liability. And so they're not the right form if you're going to hold property, if you're going to employ staff, or if you're going to enter into a number of contracts, either delivering services or for your funding. They are useful, though, for simple grant-making charities, charities that hold funds for a purpose and then make grants out to other organisations. Those grants, though, are made in the name of the trustees, but those contracts, if you like, or those agreements are generally very low risk. You're paying out money. The obligations are all on the grantee to deliver the purposes for which you're funding. So that's principally the unincorporated structure. Incorporated are probably more common these days. And some years ago, a number of us have been saying, well, one of the annoying things about the position in the UK is that there isn't a specific legal form that's designed for charities. And so the Charitable Incorporated Organisation was devised, and that is a specific legal form that is a corporate form. So it's a body corporate. It exists as a separate legal thing, so you can contract in the name of the CIO rather than the name of the trustees, and it can hold assets and do things in its own name, and it provides limited liability. The other option, which used to have to be used before the CIO became available, was a charitable company limited by guarantee. And what that means is the individuals who are the members of the company, and often the directors, the trustees of the charity, are also the members. Their liability is limited to the amount that they agree to guarantee, and that is usually £1. It's a very low amount of exposure. Some charitable companies are still registered and formed, but that's usually those for people that are used to dealing with companies. They understand the sort of company legal framework, or they're operating extensively internationally, where it may be better for overseas organisations to be more familiar with a charitable company. Now, with a charitable company, you've got a two-stage process, because you first of all have to incorporate the company. You do that with Companies House, and then you've got a legal thing that can then apply to be registered as a charity with the Charity Commission. So its board members are both company directors and charity trustees, and a charitable company has to make filings both at Companies House and with the Charity Commission. So there's dual registration. Not hugely burdensome, but it's an important point. A charitable incorporated organisation is only created and registered with the Charity Commission. So you apply to set up the CIO with the Charity Commission. So it's the Charity Commission that brings that CIO into existence when it is registered. Just going back to the unincorporated, I talked about an unincorporated association. That's a group of people that come together to form an association. A trust, a charitable trust, is where you declare a trust over a sum of money. And that's saying that actually this £10, I don't now hold as Chris Priestley's £10, I now hold it for the following charitable purposes. And you create a charitable trust. You settle that trust with those initial trust funds, and the trust is then administered, that trust fund is then administered by individual trustees, and the trust deed, which is its constitution, will set out how trustees are appointed, what the purposes of the charity are, and various other administrative provisions. Now, there's a lot in there, and there's a lot more that we could talk about. So we'd agreed with NCVO we'll do a second session on looking in far more detail at those different legal structures. So I think we can mention at the end the dates of the date rather of that session. Okay, so moving on then, we've decided what legal form we're going to adopt. Either a trust or a CIO or a charitable company. As I said, the charitable company is the one that you have to set up first, as is the charitable trust. The CIO comes into existence, it only exists once the charity is registered by the Charity Commission. And the other advantage, if you like, of a CIO, bearing in mind, I think the Charity Commission is keen to encourage people to use the CIO route because it's something that they supported the creation of, and it's a legal form designed specifically for charities. I said at the outset, to be a charity, you need to have exclusively charitable purposes and you need to exist for the public benefit. In the case of a charitable trust and a charitable company, you also need to have a minimum income requirement, minimum funds of £5,000 before you register. With a CIO, you don't need to have that minimum income or funding requirement. So in terms of the practical information you need, well, as Phil said, you need to decide who the trustees of the organisation are going to be, usually a minimum of 3 trustees. So you need to provide their names and addresses and the contact details for the charity. Those contact details will be publicly available on, as Hannah showed, the publicly searchable register of charities. There is a contacts tab, so that address, postal address usually, and email address will be available to the public. One of the perennial problems we encounter, and I'm sure many of you may have heard about this, is how we demonstrate that £5,000 proof of income in the case of a charitable trust or a charitable company. And there's a bit of a catch-22 because with a company, you can set the company up, but until you've registered as a charity, you're not recognised as a charity by the public registrar, in this case, the Charity Commission. And many banks won't be comfortable allowing you to have a charity bank account until you've registered, but you need to be able to demonstrate the charity is £5,000. One way of doing this is to create or provide to the Charity Commission what's called a pledge letter. So it's basically saying it's coming from an individual that can say, I have £5,000, and once this charity is registered and it has a bank account, I irrevocably undertake to donate £5,000 to the charity. So the Charity Commission can see that pledge. And what we've been talking to NCVO about is whether or not we might be able to get an agreed form pledge letter that we can share in the NCVO resources that the Charity Commission will accept. So that is something that we can look at. In terms of the practical information there, Hannah, is there anything else that you would mention that you think we should cover off there in terms of the practical information that's needed?
I suppose the only thing to flag is with the contact details for the charity. So there are 2 sets of contact details that you'll need to provide. One set, which is not publicly available, is going to be for the person who the Charity Commission can contact. That will again need to be both an address, a postal address, and an email address. But that will be, for example, if the Charity Commission has questions about your application, or even following application and successful registration, the Commission needs to contact you for any reason. That's the address they'll use. As Chris has flagged, there is a separate section, which is a publicly available email and postal address. In most circumstances, this has to be a real address. This cannot be a PO box unless there are exceptional circumstances, which could, for example, be if the charity that you're setting up is a refuge or is controversial in some way, and to have for example, a trustee's home address could be problematic. And there is a section on the form to add in additional information and to explain why, for example, a PO box is being used, or for example, why trustee names may not be safe to be shared publicly. So that information will be available there. The other thing to flag is that you can start filling in the form and go away and save it and come back to it. So we advise obviously having as much information up front as possible so you can get it all done. But if you haven't touched the application in 3 months, it will be automatically deleted from the system and you'll have to start all over again. So just a word of warning there.
Thanks, Anna. Just moving on to the next slide there. I'm not going to say very much about this because, again, we're going to run a separate session doing a really deep dive into the actual drafting of governing documents, and actually also how you amend governing documents once you are registered, because the law in this area is changing. There's the Charities Act 2022 received royal assent earlier this year, and the process for changing existing governing documents is also changing. So that will be a separate session. So please do sign up through NCVO if you want to learn a bit more about that. But in the time available just now, the key things to think about for your governing document, and of course, there are existing model documents on the Charity Commission website that you can download and adapt. And obviously, those are documents that we know the Charity Commission are comfortable with. So they're a very good resource. Name of the charity, that's often one of the more difficult things, because people have to, first of all, think, is there an existing charity with the same name or a similar name on the register of charities? So again, the search function that Hannah mentioned, quite sensible to have a look through that. If you are looking to establish a charitable company, you need to search the register of companies to see if the name is available. And in the case of companies, there may be a sensitive word that you are using in the title of the company that actually needs specific consent. So on Companies House, you can search a list of sensitive names. Things like fund, for example, that we often come across fund as being, the Hannah Brearley holiday fund. If you use fund in the title, you actually need to get the consent in advance from the Financial Conduct Authority, because fund tends to sort of mean in the minds of the public some sort of investment fund. So you need to set out why you want to use the word fund, and that actually this is in relation to a charity, and the FCA will generally pretty quickly give you consent. One of the important things about being a charity is you must have exclusively charitable objects. So search the existing objects of charities that are set up for a similar purpose, and you'll get an idea of the sorts of things that you need to provide in that objects clause. You will then have a list of powers in the Constitution, and you'll have to deal with trustee benefits. In most cases, trustees are volunteers, so they are not paid, but they can be paid out-of-pocket expenses and accommodation costs and things like that for accommodation if they're on trustee business away from home. But the general rule is that charity trustees are not paid. That said, it is possible to, in advance of registering the charity, draft a provision that allows some trustees to be paid, and that will then need to go through a process of approval with the Charity Commission. And usually the Commission will say, well, you've got to justify why you need to pay trustees, how you'll set their remuneration, how the trustees themselves who are being paid won't decide over their own pay. But that, I think, is a level of detail that we'll go into the deep dive session that I mentioned. You also need to think about what might happen if you wind the charity up. Where would you want any surplus funds that you haven't spent to go? Would that be to another charity for similar purposes, or would it be to a named charity that you want to pre-agree? So that again is something else to think about. Okay, moving on, I think it's over to you again, Phil.
Thanks, Chris. So just to pick out a few details about some of the key areas when we're coming to registration that the Commission will be interested in. So as I mentioned earlier on, picking your trustees is quite key. You need to make sure that you have at least 3 people. The Commission won't really register a charity with fewer than 3. You can have a corporate trustee, which again we might think about more in a later session, but that's something of a halfway house between an incorporated and an unincorporated charity. So there, technically, you might have one trustee being a company, but that would itself need at least 3 directors. So 3 real people, if you like, will need to be there to control the charity. Again, make sure you've got the right balance of skills and experience. Can be useful to have somebody with legal experience, can be useful to have somebody with financial and perhaps risk experience particularly. And also just think about the work that you're doing. Are you going to be working with adults at risk or children? You might need somebody with safeguarding experience. Are you going to be working overseas? Just try to craft your board in a way that covers the right bases. We're sometimes asked about location of trustees. It is certainly possible to have trustees of a charity set up in England and Wales who are themselves based in another country or have a different nationality. The Commission likes to see a majority of trustees in the UK, and even more so with charitable trusts that, as Chris said, don't have their own legal personality in this country. So that's something to be aware of. The trustees will all need to understand their duties before they get on board with this process. And again, the Commission will want to understand that the trustees do understand and accept the obligations that they're assuming, and they'll need to sign a trustee declaration as part of the registration process to confirm that. Just very briefly on the slide, I've put some of the principal duties that you would need to make sure that your trustees understood. So acting in the best interests of the charity is the overarching one. It will also be very important to manage any conflicts of interest, by which we mean financial interest, and loyalty, by which we mean a duty of loyalty that might be owed to another organisation. So if you have two sister charities, say, and one is making a grant to the other, somebody who sits on both boards would be subject to a conflict of loyalty. So another thing to think about. And a duty of independence. So trustees do need to exercise their own independent judgment when acting as charity trustee. There are more duties and more nuance, but just to introduce some of the key ones. Next slide, please, Hannah. Some more of the roles that might be involved, and again, this will need to be gone through in the Charity Commission registration process. So Chris has touched on members, which would exist in the context of a charitable company or a CIO. So if you think of an organisation like the National Trust, it will have many thousands of members. Those people have a formal legal role in respect of the charity's administration, but they're not trustees. They'll be able to vote on certain things. So often that will be amending the charity's governing document. It might be around winding up in certain situations. Sometimes members would have a power to direct specific activities of the trustees. Sometimes they would be able to elect and remove trustees. So it's an important role. And again, the members of charities do have a similar duty to act in the best interests of the furtherance of the charity's purposes, so the objects that we were discussing earlier on. And they also are subject to similar principles around not benefiting from their position and not acting when subject to a conflict of interest or loyalty. So think about members in the context of your structure and whether that's an area that you need to dig into. And also, if you're a charity that's been set up by an individual or individuals, you might need to think about those people's role and position going forward. Some charity founders like to preserve a degree of personal control that they might put into the governing document, and we can look at that in more detail in the governing document session. You might need to think about, well, can those people be paid? You sometimes have people founding charities and then looking also to be employed by that charity and be paid a salary, which is not something the Charity Commission is wild about normally, but as Chris mentioned, you can have trustees who are paid in the right circumstances, and it will really be about demonstrating why that would be in the charity's best interests and making sure that the right legal elements had been covered off that actually made any payments to individuals connected with the charity permissible. You might also want to think about succession if you're a charity founder, and about the kind of personal association with the charity's own brand that might be appropriate for a founder, as well as perhaps with private businesses that you might have. Next slide, please, Hannah. So very briefly, just to touch on the application form to make sure that we leave plenty of room for discussion. I can see that a lot of questions have come in. The application form to register a charity is quite long and quite detailed. We won't go through all of it here, but just to introduce it, I suppose. It gets longer as well, depending on some of your answers to questions. So if you answer some of the questions in ways where the Commission would like to gather more detail, it can drop down further, more probing questions. So you can end up having to put in quite a lot of detail. So Hannah's point about the form potentially disappearing if you don't work on it for a while is very well made. Once you've got going, make sure that you do, well, you can perhaps fill it in a Word document offline, or at least if you don't do that, make sure that you do get your application in before all of your hard work disappears. But again, very briefly, what the form covers. So it covers what the charity is set up for and what it does, where it does that. So the Commission likes you to say which countries the charity operates in. And it's increasingly interested in that question because it identifies particular risks associated with particular countries. It might want to understand if you're actually going to have on-the-ground operations overseas, let's say, rather than granting money to local organisations in that country. Who will be involved? So as I said, who are the trustees? What are all of their contact details? What will their relationship be with the charity? So this is where you'd get into any trustee payments that might be authorised for your charity, which again is unusual, but can be done in the right circumstances. Whether the charity will have any relationship with other connected parties. So again, businesses perhaps that a trustee might have set up, which is an area of quite keen interest for charities. That's also where the Commission will be looking at whether the trustees are sufficiently independent of the charity, of each other, so that they can make proper decisions with any conflicts of interest or loyalty being managed. And finally, where the money is coming from, so where the assets are coming from, and what the tax considerations are around that, just to make sure that, with an eye to a few negative stories over the last many years, ensuring that this charity isn't being set up as a cynical tax avoidance mechanism, which does sadly happen. And that's something that the Commission likes to check out. So as I say, quite a long form, quite detailed, and something to work through very carefully. Next slide, please, Hannah. A few points here just about things that can make the Charity Commission prick up its ears, if you like, and we always say put your application in the hard pile. So any of these issues, the Commission will often want to ask more questions about. So things overseas, close relationship with non-charities, as I've mentioned, payments to trustees, political or campaigning activity. Charities can sometimes operate in those areas, but it's a little bit fraught. So somewhere the Commission will ask questions about. Similarly, human rights or environmental causes are issues where charities can often stray into political activities in the sense of campaigning to change the law, potentially, which is, again, at the fringes of where charities can safely operate. And that's usually somewhere that we'd suggest you take advice. Next slide, please, Hannah. And back over to Chris.
Thanks, Phil. In terms of just the next steps then, and I think just thinking about everything that Phil's just said about the application process, what you're doing is sending a submission to a civil servant who doesn't know you, doesn't know anything about you. So that application form has to set out your stall and to prove to the Commission, because what they're looking for is this a genuine charity? Is it set up for purposes that the law says are charitable? So there's nothing non-charitable in your purposes. And do the trustees really understand what it means to be a charity? So do invest the time in that application. More is definitely worth including to demonstrate that you really do get and you know, what a charity is and why you're setting this up and how it will be funded and how it's sustainable. Once the application goes in, you get an automated response to say it's been acknowledged, so make sure you have got that. And that response should say how long it will take for you to get a substantive response back from the Commission about your application. And that changes over time. We see sometimes the Commission has sort of longer turnaround times than others, but I'd have thought a good few weeks before you get that substantive response. Sometimes the Commission can surprise you and can register things very quickly, but usually it's a good few weeks before you get the response, and you will then be allocated what's called a case officer. It's very common for there to be a number of follow-up questions. Actually, the Commission is really helpful. So if they're satisfied that, yeah, this is a genuine charity, but we just have a few issues with the drafting of the objects, quite often they will suggest the wording that if you can agree to it, they will be happy to register. That all being well and good, you've got your charity registered and it will appear on the Register of Charities and you'll get your registered charity number. That's not the end of the process, because you will also want to register for what's called tax purposes with HMRC, and you can't do that until you've got that registered charity number. It's important to do that, to complete the registration with HMRC, because that's what means, that's what will enable the charity to claim the tax reliefs that charities are allowed to claim. The principal one, which most people want to get, is gift aid. That's where I, as a donor to charity, can claim gift aid, and the charity can claim a top-up on my donation. So it's a very valuable relief. The other reliefs are if the charity is sitting on funds that it doesn't need and has invested them, those investment returns, bank interest, things like that, they don't get taxed. And if the charity is in the fortunate position of buying property, then charities can claim tax relief on the stamp duty tax, which applies when you generally buy property. Those are the main reliefs. Charities are not automatically exempted from VAT, but there are certain things which charities buy in or which charities do, which are either zero rated or treated in a different way. So that doesn't blanket, that HMRC recognition doesn't really apply to your VAT position. That's quite a detailed set of rules that apply on VAT. Once the charity has been registered, you've got to have a bank account, which I know can be difficult, and I know NCVO is doing some work to try and look at how there can be more providers of bank accounts for charities. So once you've got the bank account, you then fill in the application form to HMRC, which asks many of the same questions that you'll already answered for the Charity Commission. And I don't think we've ever had a case where once you've got the charity registered with the Charity Commission, you're not then automatically registered with HMRC if you go through this application process. HMRC is a bit quicker than the Charity Commission. Usually it's a couple of weeks from the application going in till you get the confirmation that you're registered also for tax purposes, and that registration is backdated to the date that you were registered with the Charity Commission. But if you want to claim gift aid and you want to be absolutely certain that you'll get the gift aid, you must wait until you've got that HMRC registration confirmation through. Just very quickly, Hannah, do you want to just mention the details you need to provide around the authorised officials and responsible persons?
Yes, of course. So this is, as you can see on the slide, this is relevant to your HMRC application. And so there's, it's another form. It's slightly fiddly, but as Chris has said, it's a lot more, usually a lot speedier than the Commission. So there's a difference here between authorised persons, authorised officials and responsible persons. Both will need to be people within your charity. And this comes back to Phil's point earlier about picking your trustees or if you're going to have staff, executive staff, really carefully. The key difference is that your authorised official is the person that can speak to HMRC. So if you need somebody who has the requisite skills and experience and knowledge in order to be your key liaison point with HMRC. So this can be one or two people, it doesn't just have to be one person, but ordinarily this would be your finance trustee or your finance director or somebody in that kind of role. What you would then also have are these responsible persons, and these are the people that are considered to be have the management of the charity. There is a form associated with your application to HMRC, which is called a fit and proper persons form, which will need to be filled out. So you need up to 3 of these responsible persons, and they can be the trustees. Again, they can be members of staff. Ordinarily, they're usually your trustees, and what they do usually need is a form of ID. Usually this is done through a national insurance number. So if you have trustees who are overseas, this might be a better role for your UK-based trustees, just in order to get the process done. But really the key difference is, who do you want to talk to HMRC, and that person needs to be your authorised official.
Thanks, Anna. And then just the penultimate slide. Once you've registered with HMRC and the Charity Commission, what does that mean? Well, you're a registered charity, and there are bodies that you can apply to for funding that will only fund registered charities. So you tick that eligibility box for them. You will have compliance obligations. You need to make an annual return to the Charity Commission. You'll get details about how you do that from the Commission once you're registered. And there are things that you need to report to the Charity Commission during the lifetime of the charity, if trustees change, or if you have something called a serious incident arising. And there's very good guidance on the Commission's website about when you are obliged as trustees to report a serious incident to the Charity Commission. That's usually if there's been, for example, a safeguarding issue in the organisation, there's been a large fraud or theft, or there is a reputational issue about the charity. And as you might expect, you've got to file your accounts. There are different thresholds that require different things to be done. But generally, if you have income exceeding £25,000, you need to file accounts, but they do not need to be audited. You need to get an auditor if your income exceeds £1 million. Over 25 and less than $1 million, you'll need an accountant to help you, and they will independently examine the accounts to make sure they give a true and fair view of the charity's financial position. I think that's probably all. We've talked about the tax benefits, so I think that's probably all that we're going to say, other than moving on to the next slide at the very end, I think, which has the useful resources. I don't know, Amy or Josie, if you want to say any more about that, and then we can throw open to questions. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much. Yes, I was going to run through these at the end, actually. I've got a couple of slides that I'll use to close up, but okay, we'll be sending this out to everybody. It's all of the resources and useful places to go that were mentioned throughout the presentation. But I'll come to that at the end, I think. Chris, I'll run through those. Okay. Hannah, do you want to stop sharing the slides so we can see people? And I think we're going to stop recording there.